And for the first time, South Korea and Japan joined the leaders of NATO at a summit in Madrid, Spain.
The alliance forms a new strategic concept in light of new threats and challenges from Russia as well as from China. VOA correspondent Jessica Stone has this report from Washington, D.C.
Hello from Washington. Well, we are indeed seeing a significant presence of Asian leaders at the NATO Leaders Summit in Madrid, Spain. For the first time, we see South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol attending the NATO Leaders Summit. He won the Blue House, of course, on a foreign policy of making Seoul a larger global player. Seoul plans to establish a diplomatic mission to NATO in Brussels. Another first this week, a Japanese prime minister is attending a NATO summit. Japan is the only Asian member of the group of 7, and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is attending as part of NATO's goal of increasing the political dialogue and practical cooperation with the Asia-Pacific region. Japan, Australia, and New Zealand already have missions to NATO. This year, we're seeing much more focus by NATO on the response to the rise of China. NATO has named China as a challenge to its security and to its interests, and it could play a role in securing supply chains and maritime access. Of course, Beijing has responded, calling this an effort to stir up confrontation.
공급망을 포함한 이런
South Korea, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand have been invited to the meetings as the Asia-Pacific Four, as close cooperation between the Indo-Pacific and NATO have become even more crucial in these times. While there's no need to call out specific countries, we need to facilitate cooperation between countries based on shared values of freedom, human rights, and rule of law, and that's what Indo-Pacific nations and NATO nations should build together.
We urge NATO to learn its lessons and not to use this crisis in Ukraine as an excuse to stoke worldwide bloc confrontation or a new Cold War, and not to look for imaginary enemies in Asia-Pacific or artificially create contradictions and divisions. We firmly oppose certain elements clamoring for NATO's involvement in Asia-Pacific.
It's worth noting that earlier this week, leaders of the 7 largest economies across the world, known as the G7, unveiled a $600 billion initiative to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. It is a rebrand of a plan announced a year ago, now being called the Partnership for a Global Infrastructure. So far, the partnership hasn't announced too many projects, but there are some in Angola, Senegal, and Singapore. And we should note that the U.S. and China are expected to meet on the sidelines of the upcoming G20 in Indonesia next month.